You're most likely spending too much time documenting your database. I'll show you why it's a waste of time and how to solve this problem. Picture this. You've started working on an existing system and you need to understand the database. But there is no documentation on how the database works and no entity relationship diagram to help you understand the structure. You have to go digging into the database itself. You might browse the list of tables in your SQL Editor's Object Explorer. You probably run a few select queries on the tables just to see what the data looks like and try to piece together how the tables are related. If you're lucky, the editor may have a way to generate an ERD, which can help. I've seen and done this kind of work many times in my career, and you probably have as well. This kind of work can take a lot of time, especially because you need to understand the database before you even start working on it. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you have an entity relationship diagram that has been created for the database. Whenever I'm at work and I find one of these on Confluence or the GitHub repo, it makes me a little happier. This is helpful. But then you or the team makes a change to the database as part of a new feature and the diagram is not updated, which means the diagram is now out of date. And you can't be sure that the diagram matches the code, or you're wasting time looking at the diagram and wondering why the database is different. You or the team has to put in the effort to update the diagram and ensure it is published where it needs to be. What happens when a new starter joins the team? You don't have an ERD, but you are familiar with the database, so you're spending an hour or more with this person to explain the database structure, how it works, and how things are related. If only there was a way to have up-to-date documentation on the database that was easy to maintain. There is a better way. There's a concept called Docs as Code that means that documentation can be written using the same process and tools as the code. This article, which I'll link in the description, explains it pretty well. There are other articles and books on this as well. So what if the database was documented alongside the code? And there was a live version of the database documentation that was up to date. This would mean you and the team can spend less time trying to keep an ERD up to date and more time doing your other work. We can achieve this with a tool called dbdocs. The headline here says build database documentation easily, and that's exactly what it lets you do. Let's see an example of how we actually do this. First, we click Get Started. You're taken to the Quick Start guide. dbdocs has a free plan to let you generate documentation. They have paid plans with more features, which you can see on the website, but we'll use the free plan in this video. First, you'll need to have Node.js and NPM installed on your computer. I already have this, and if you need to install it, you can either use a terminal command or download a package. I'll add a link in the description for steps on how to do this. The next step is to install the dbdocs package. To do this, open Terminal on macOS or the command prompt on Windows. Run the command mentioned on this page in the terminal. It will now get installed. Once it has completed, you can run the command dbdocs and see some output like this, meaning it has worked. The second step is to define your database using an open source markup language called DBML. You can generate this DBML from your database or from an SQL file, but for this example, I'll create a simple one from scratch. I'll open Visual Studio Code, but you can use whatever text editor you like. I'll create a new file called database.dbml. We'll document a simple database with two tables. First, we add a project name, which we'll see in our documentation soon. Then we can define the database type. We could add some notes here, but we'll keep it simple for now. Next, we add our first table. Let's say we have a table called customer, so I'll add that here with a few columns, a primary key, two name columns, and a created date time. I'll add a second table just to see how the relationships are shown. This is the orders table and it has a primary key and a foreign key to the customer table. We have our columns. To define a relationship, we add a ref keyword at the bottom and specify it like this. We add both columns with an arrow in between, and the arrow points to the primary key. Our file is now ready, so I'll save it. The next step is to log into your dbdocs account using the command line. But we don't have an account yet. That's okay, we don't need to create an account. All we need is an email address. So go back to the terminal and enter dbdocs login. You'll be asked which method you want to use to log in. Type the number 1 for email and press enter. Enter your email address here. This will be used to associate your documentation to, and you'll receive a code to confirm your address shortly. Once you do this, you should receive an email with a one-time password. Enter this from your email and press enter. You have now logged into DB Docs. The next step is to generate the documentation. We can do this on the command line. Run the command dbdocs build with the parameter of your database.dbml file. You can enter the path to this file or change to the folder that contains this file and run the command there. For me, it's easier to change to the directory where the dbml file is saved, so I'll do that. Then we add 2 dashes, then immediately add the word project, then a space, then the name of our project, which I'll call new store, the same value from the dbml file. Press enter. The database documentation will be generated in a few seconds, and you'll be given a link in the terminal here. Select this URL here and copy it. Then open it in a web browser. We can see a web page here with your database documentation. It's a simple looking page, but it's quite powerful. We have the project name on the top left. On the left panel is a list of tables we defined. We only have 2 here, but we can have many more once we add them to our markup file. There's a search box here for searching your database documentation. In the main section, there are a few tabs. The Wiki tab is the main tab and it shows some metadata about the documentation at the top. Then we have the number of tables and columns in the database, and versions of documentation that have been generated. Below that is a list of the tables. You can click on any of the tables either on the main page here or the left panel and see the documentation for that table. You can see all of the columns, data types, constraints, default values and relationships to other tables. If we scroll down, we can see a small diagram that shows how the table relates to other tables. On the Diagram tab, we have an auto-generated ERD based on the markup file. It looks clean and easy to read. There are some controls at the bottom for zooming, highlighting relationships and more. The final tab is the changelog, which shows a history of changes made to this documentation. We only have one change so far, but we can see a lot of details about it. It says version 1, when it was made and the number of objects that we changed. We can also see which objects were changed. Quite handy. We've created a simple set of documentation for this database. There's a lot more that this tool can do. We can add notes or comments at several places in the file. Let's do this. We'll add a short description of the project to the top of the file. This area supports Markdown syntax, so it's quite flexible in its formatting. You can add this note keyword at several places in the markup file to describe columns and tables. I'll describe the customer table here, which may seem self-explanatory, but it can be helpful. I'll also add a note to a column, which we can do here. I've described the column as well as mentioned it's in the UTC time zone. Once we've made changes, I'll save the file. Then back in the terminal, we can run the same build command as we did before. I'll press up to bring back that command and press enter. I get an error here because I've entered the incorrect syntax. This build command has a syntax checker built in, so any errors are detected and won't break the documentation. The reason this error happens is that I need to enclose this note inside square brackets. I can do this, save the file and rerun the build command. After a moment, the command is completed and the same URL is shown. We can see a few places where our notes have been shown. On the main page, we can see the big heading here of New Store Database and the description under it. This came from the top of our markup file. We can click on the changelog and see that we have another version. This shows version 2 as well as the objects that were modified. Back on the Wiki tab, we can open the Customer tab and see a description here. We entered this in our markup file as a note on the Customer table. We can scroll down to the diagram and see a little note icon appear on the table header. If we hover over that, we can see the note we added. We can also hover over the order date field and see the note that was added on that column. I can click on the cust order table to show the docs for that table, and in the field list, we can see the same note added to the column here. So this is a pretty handy feature to help you document your database. It's also possible to integrate this process into your Git workflow. This means you can make changes to your code and add your database DBML file into your repository. When you commit your code, a command is run to rebuild your documentation. You don't need to manually run the build command each time. Using a tool like dbdocs means you'll spend far less time looking through the database to understand it, as you'll have up-to-date documentation as both an ERD and tables and columns. You'll spend less time trying to keep the ERD and docs up to date, as you can update a single markup file and the rest is generated. You'll also spend less time explaining the database to people, as the foundation of this is done by reading these docs. You can also share the URL for the documentation so everyone has a single place to look at it. You can share it via email, add it to Confluence sites, your GitHub README file, a Notion page, or wherever you want. You can even embed the diagram or documentation inside other pages on Confluence or Notion or other places. This is a pretty handy tool and can really help you and your team save time with your documentation. If you want to know how to use SQL files with GitHub, you'll want to watch this video next, where I walk you through how to set up a GitHub account and use SQL files in a repository. Thanks for watching.